Welcome to lecture number 6. This is Progressive Georgia in the schizophrenic state. As much as Georgia was progressing, much of Georgia was regressing. And we will find out how Georgia was advancing and reforming during the progressive era, but at the same time, many things that Georgia was doing was not reforming. It was during this period of time as well. Tom Watson, who had been a progressive, he'd been a Democratic congressman, then he was in the Populist Party, one of the kingmakers in the Populist Party. After the end of the Populist Party by 1904, Tom Watson's back as a Democrat. And he was a mover and shaker for many years in the Democratic Party in the early part of the 20th century in Georgia. He was a kingmaker. He could make or break you with his typewriter. He published a paper called the Jeffersonian, and through that paper, Tom Watson either made governors or brought down governors, senators, and so forth. So he influenced state elections all the way up in the 1920s when he himself was elected as a U.S. Senator from Georgia until his death. He was notorious from his typewriter as a bigot and racist. He influenced the lynching of Leo Frank, we'll talk about in a minute. He hated blacks, Jews, and Catholics. His newspaper is constantly filled with venom against African Americans and against Jewish people and against Catholics. In his elected senator in 1920, he only served a short period of time before he died. Tom Watson is a very great example of the Georgia in this era of being progressive. He was for some progressive ideas, but yet then again, he was very regressive in the way that he thought about African Americans and Jews and Catholics. Hoke Smith was the editor of the Atlanta Journal. At that time, it was a bi-weekly paper in Atlanta. He ran against the editor of the Atlanta Constitution in the 1906 election and was governor for 2 years before re-elected, and then he resigned in order to become senator from the state of Georgia. And during his period of time, there was in office as governor, some reforms were made. First, we regulate the rates of railroads in the state, so states can't charge different rates in the state. So within the state, the juvenile court system is set up where juveniles are tried in separate court than adults. Into the convict lease system. If you owned say a farm or turpentine steel, you could pay for someone's fine, and instead of them going to the county prison, they would be released to you. You could run your own private prison in Georgia. Now, it supposedly ended this convict lease system, but but they were still private prisons in Georgia all the way up into the 1940s. So there was people that skirted the law. And for the first time, we have a 4-month compulsory school term in the state of Georgia. And that's not very much time to go to school, 4 months, but that was because of agriculture. Children worked all the way up until October, and then by February, early March, they were back on the farm. But those were some of the progressive reforms that took place in Georgia during this period of time. Another progressive reform in Georgia during this period of time was in 1903, the health department. If you've ever got a shot at the health department here in the county, then that was created in 1903, state of Georgia. The first thing was trying to fight pellagra, which is poor diet. And of course, it took a while to find out that niacin was the cause of pellagra. Hookworm problem, which the Rockefeller Foundation found the problem was poor sanitation and barefooted children. But the other was vaccine for smallpox and typhoid. And they would mix those medicine for those shots in the basement of the Capitol building. The first public health, state health department was in the basement of the now Capitol building. Typhoid was a scourge of the early 20th century. You can go to many graveyards and you can look at entire family plots, and you can see children that died within weeks and months of each other in the same family, and you can almost know that that was during the typhoid epidemic outbreak in the community. I lost a couple of great uncles during typhoid fever epidemic in the early 1900s during this time. And then on my mom's side of the family, I lost her grandfather and several of her uncles. So it was a absolute wonderful thing when the typhoid inoculation came along. Now we're going backwards in Georgia, regression. And the first thing was disenfranchisement. We've talked about disenfranchisement before in 2111 with the poll tax and the literacy test, the grandfather clause. And if you remember, the grandfather clause is that if your grandfather voted in 1860, then you can vote. Well, very few African American grandfathers voted in 1860, or poor whites for that matter. But that wasn't satisfying enough. The Democrats decided to say that they were a closed party, and they could decide who were Democrats in the state and who were not. And so they created what was called a Democratic White Party, that only whites could vote in the Democratic primary. And since the Democrats were virtually the only party in the state, that meant that it was only white people would be able to run for office or win, at least. This is going to last up until the 1940s. Several lawsuits against the Democratic Party is going to change that in the state. And this was not just in Georgia. This was duplicated all over the South, this Democratic white primary. Also, Georgia rejected the 19th Amendment, women's right to vote, when it came in as well. Now here's Georgia fuzzy math for you. It's called the county unit system. They decided that they did not want the urban areas electing state officials, governors and senators and so forth. And so they used a county unit system to elect the governor. Now, this is not electoral college. The electoral college rewards the large states. California gets 55 votes in the electoral college, the largest populated state. The county unit system rewarded the small rural counties. There are 121 rural counties. They got 2 votes each. Well, I believe that would be 242 in math. Whereas the 8 urban areas, the largest counties like Fulton and Decatur and Bibb and Chatham, Savannah, Chatham, Bibb is Macon, Richmond, Augusta, Muskogee, Columbus, they only got 6 votes. That's 48 to elect the governor. Now, that doesn't add up. Eccles, Glasscock, and Quitman County, the smallest counties, still are today, they had a combined population of 6,980, whereas Fulton County at that time had 556,326. And yet, those 3 counties equaled Fulton County as far as voting for the governor. This county unit system is going to elect rural governors, Democrats, and it's a blow against the Republican Party, because the Republican Party was strongest in those counties at the time. This will last until 1962 with a couple of court decisions will change it. The Democratic Party will be sued, and then there's also a federal case, Baker versus Carr, and this will finally be declared unconstitutional. But you had a few governors elected minority, and they're not elected by the large counties. They were elected by the small rural counties. This gives you a graph of the fuzzy math of Georgia's elections on the county unit system. The rural area had 59% of the vote for governor. The urban only 12%, and the town, which Waycross, Valdosta, Jessup were in the town group, Wayne County, Ware, Lowndes, had 29%. So again, it shows that only the minority got to elect the governor under the county unit system. I usually let my students decide whether prohibition is a progression or a regression. That's up to you to decide which you think, that this was a good reform or a bad reform. Prohibition of alcohol in Georgia was tied mostly to racism as well as a moral issue. Women, of course, it was a domestic violence issue with women. Women were the great movers and shakers and advocates of prohibition in the state because of the domestic violence that caused. Counties were given a choice, and by 1907, most counties had outlawed what was called drink, or there was prohibition. Race entered the issue in 1906 because of the Atlanta race riots, which we're going to talk about more in a minute. Many people believe that what caused the race riots was alcoholism. Because the 1907 law had left too many loopholes, um, finally by 1916 Georgia went completely dry. Prohibition took over in Georgia, and this is 5 years before prohibition is the law of the United States. Now, did that get rid of people drinking? No. Did it get rid of people manufacturing it? No, it did not. It still had people manufacturing alcohol and plenty of people drinking it. It just was illegal. Um, I'm not sure how well enforced it was in the state. Um, it depended on many factors whether it was enforced in the state of Georgia. 1906, there was a heated governor's race, and the governor's race was between Hoke Smith, publisher of the Journal, and Clark Howell, the editor of the Atlanta Constitution. Not to be confused with the um, current Clark Howell that works for WSB Radio in Atlanta. But this was Clark Howell in 1906. And one of the main issues was disenfranchisement of African Americans. The newspapers in Atlanta continue to stir up sensational stories about the black community, and especially about black men attacking white women. And on September the 22nd, all the papers in Atlanta got together and published these unsubstantiated stories about 4 attacks on white women by black men in Atlanta. Not a one of them have ever been substantiated that these events actually happened. White people with clubs and went down into the black neighborhood on Auburn Avenue, started breaking out glass in black-owned businesses, beating people, turned a streetcar upside down, set it on fire. You can go find the statistics on how many are killed and how many are, and I don't give the statistics for the fact that they're so widespread, and so many discrepancies on how many were killed and how many were hurt. And I don't even know if those estimates are, I think they're too conservative. I think they're too low. And I can't really find out what I would consider reasonable numbers. But these race riots create great sensation. The governor had to send in the National Guard to stop the riots in Atlanta. A couple of days later, there was a shootout with black leaders of Atlanta and the police who tried to break up a meeting of the black leaders. And this is going to lead belief that there needs to be, alcohol doesn't need to be sold. Racism enters the prohibition issue because the belief is that the reason that their attack on the white women is because of alcohol, because of men drinking. And so the Atlanta race riots is one of the most horrible parts of progressive Georgia history, and this is part of Georgia regression instead of progress. Again, the aftermath of the riots is prohibition uh, because of the racism, that the blaming of alcoholism on the riots, disenfranchisement of black voters. This gives more fuel to the Georgia legislature and the governor to pass the literacy test and poll taxes and the Democratic white primary. And African Americans began to turn away from the accommodation of Dr. Washington to the ideas of Dr. DuBose. They believe the only way they're ever going to get equal rights now is not by working for it and waiting for it. They're going to have to actually protest and agitate in order to gain their equal rights in America. Again, for African Americans in Georgia during the early part of the 20th century was just like Georgia during this era. There were some positives, mostly negatives, but there were some positives. Um, Most African Americans lived in poverty on farms. Some African Americans owned their own farm, and so they were somewhat better off on the economic level by owning their own farm. There was a small growing middle class of African Americans during this period of time of teachers, educators, doctors, and lawyers. One of the greatest success stories of African Americans during this period of time is a gentleman whose picture is at the top of this page, um, Alonzo Herndon. He was raised a sharecropper out toward Villa Rica, west of Atlanta. He come to Atlanta and opened a barber shop. And pretty soon he opened 2 or 3 barber shops throughout Atlanta. He took his money and invested it and opened something called Atlanta Life Insurance Company. It was very difficult for African Americans to get life insurance. Most companies would not sell to African Americans life insurance. So that made it very difficult to pay for funerals. And of course, in those days, a funeral was $100, but $100 was, like 3,000 or 4,000 today. And so he started Atlanta Life Insurance Company to help African Americans bury their dead, bury their loved ones. And today, Atlanta Life is still a very viable financial company throughout this world. And if you ever go downtown Atlanta, you know exactly where the headquarters of Atlanta Life is, because Alonzo Herndon's bronze statue is out in the front of the building. And at one time, Atlanta Life was the largest African American owned company in the United States. On the sadder and most regressive that we'll talk about on the slideshow is the lynching. The great Ralph McNeil, who was the editor of the Atlanta Constitution for years, had talked about how the lynching, and he talked about Tom Watson. He said there's no telling how many dead bodies lie beneath the Georgia soil put there by the typewriter of Tom Watson. And I hate to talk about this one, but this is probably the worst of them all, and it happened right in my home county. Sidney Johnson was arrested for a crime, small crime. And he was released to a man in North Brooks County called Hampton Smith on that convict lease system that we talked about. Hamp Smith treated him like a slave. And so Hamp Smith had beat Sidney Johnson several times, and finally Sidney Johnson had enough of it. He picked up a piece of lighter wood and hit Hamp Smith upside the head and killed him. Well, Johnson realized, him being an African American, that he had to leave. that they were going to lynch him. So he ran toward Valdosta from what is Morven, Georgia, Barney, between Morven and Barney, Georgia, which is a good 30, 40 miles. And so a manhunt ensued, and they started lynching every black male between Morven and the Lowndes County line, trying to find Sidney Johnson. Mary Turner, husband, was one of them killed in the manhunt. And she threatened all weekend that she was going to go to Quitman, the county seat of Brooks County, and she was going to swear out a warrant for the rest of the men who killed her husband. And she was expecting a child. I think she had already had about 4 children, about her 5th child. And Mary Turner was lynched. And I'm not going to, that's as far as I can go, tell you the story. If you want to know the rest of the story, and I warn you, it is not nice. It's not nice. It's not a nice story to be told. I have the website that you can go to. Sidney was finally found down in Valdosta, down around Troop Street, in a shootout. He was shot, and his body was dragged all the way back to Morven, Georgia, to Campground Methodist Church, where they finally cut loose his dead body. This is one of the most horrible things, and this is the tip of the iceberg of the lynching in Georgia. There is a website that details all the lynchings in Georgia that you can find, and this is a time of absolute horror and the violence against African American people in this state. Education was progressing in Georgia, however. This is one of the positives. Georgia Tech was created in 1888, which is still around today. Then the Perry Act created a district agricultural school in every congressional district in Georgia. Georgia had 11, and Georgia's population grew, then we had 12. Many of these are major schools today that started out. West Georgia University started out as West Georgia A&M. Tifton A&M became ABAC College. Douglas A&M, Agricultural Mechanical School, became South Georgia, and now South Georgia State. East Georgia, and over in Swainsboro, started out as a agricultural mechanical school. All these schools have just become major schools today, but it was the Perry Act that created them, and they were actually more like high schools originally, but they became junior colleges and then universities. There are 3 historically black schools in Georgia. Savannah State actually started in Athens, and then a large acreage of land was given to the state, and it was moved to Savannah in 1890. It formed 1890. In the early 1900s, it moved to Savannah to become Savannah State. Then Fort Valley State and Albany State were created in the early part of the 1900s as historically black schools. So at least Georgia was progressing in providing higher education for African Americans. These schools mostly were teaching schools, um, to educate teachers, uh, to um, to educate to for the schools. The new 4-year compulsory education in Georgia was not just for white students, also for African American students. So it mostly was to train teachers for the schools in Georgia. Then you have Georgia Normal and Industrial College in Milledgeville, and South Georgia Women's Normal College. Now, normal here means teacher school. Um, and these were women's schools up until 1967 for the one in Milledgeville, which is today Georgia State College and or Georgia College and State University. Today, and it's co-ed. It became co-ed in 1967. South Georgia Women's Normal College had a couple of name changes. It was Georgia Women's College until 1950, when it became co-ed, allowing men in, and now it's, of course, Valdosta State University. But this was an opportunity to give women education to become teachers. Again, because of the new 4-year compulsory education, there were need for teachers in the state. This is a picture of a 13-year-old girl, Mary Fagan, who's going to become one of the greatest tragedies in the progressive era in Georgia and lead to one of the most sensational trials that is still controversial to this very day. Georgia historians disagree about the trial of Leo Frank. She was found tragically dead in the basement of a factory in Atlanta. And the murder trial is controversial because of the religion of the accused. Whether he did it or not, there is so much division among historians and so much among people that read the case to this day. April 26th of 1913 was Confederate Memorial Day. It was a holiday. Little Mary Fagan came down to the National Pencil Factory to pick up her pay on a holiday. No one was there except for the janitor and the owner or manager of the National Pencil Factory, Leo Frank. That was Mary Fagan was found a day later, molested and dead in the basement of the National Pencil Factory. At first, the security man, who wasn't even there, was arrested because there were some notes found near the body. But then they decided that Newt Lee, the night watchman, was not guilty. He wasn't even at the factory. And so the arrest was Leo Frank. Now, they could have arrested the janitor, but Tom Watson's paper had a great influence on arresting Frank because of his religion. He was Jewish. There is a lot of violence against Jews in Atlanta during this period of time because, again, of the typewriter of Tom Watson. Leo Frank is convicted and sentenced to death. in this trial. The governor of the state of Georgia at that time, Governor John Slanton, did his own investigation. And he decided that Frank was not guilty. And he commuted his sentence to life. Now notice the difference in the words of commuted. He did not pardon Leo Frank. And it would seem like, well, if you believe the man was innocent, then he should have been pardoned. Slanton realized that if he pardoned him and let him out of jail, that he would be killed. And so what he was hoping was that if he commuted his sentence to life, that in years, many years later, somebody would finally give him a pardon. When all the sensation of this story would finally die down. Slanton lost all political power in Georgia. The governor's mansion was protesters surrounded it, and Slanton had to leave the city. That's how bad it became. And by commuting the sentence to life, Tom Watson's typewriter went crazy, or he went crazy on his typewriter, calling for the Knights of Mary Fagan, calling for when is Mary Fagan going to get justice? When is her cold body ever going to get justice? So a group, a mob of three automobiles went down to Milledgeville, the state prison. They cut the power to the prison, and they broke Leo Frank out of prison. They drove him from Milledgeville back to Cobb County near Mary Fagan's house and lynched him. Now, whether he was guilty or not, nobody deserves to be lynched by a mob. No one. And the reason of his lynching was not because necessarily he was guilty. It was because of his religion. He was being Jewish. And then the morbid thing, people came out to get pieces of Leo Frank's clothing and his fingernails and everything else for souvenirs. And this is just absolutely morbid and horrible. Part of a regressive Georgia, not a progressive Georgia. The Klan had laid dormant in the South ever since the KKK Act and Ulysses S. Grant's administration had run it way underground. But a insurance salesman from Atlanta and a part-time preacher, William Simmons, is going to resurrect it in 1915 on Thanksgiving night. He was influenced by the Leo Frank case, for one, and also by the blockbuster movie The Birth of a Nation, which glorified the Klan. And so Simmons and the group, who mostly were the ones that lynched Leo Frank, were going up on Stone Mountain on Thanksgiving night of 1915, and they burn a cross, they do all kind of ceremonies, and they resurrect the Klan from its dormant state. And so now violence has a name again in the state of Georgia, or in the country. The KKK is revived. Well, for William Simmons, it wasn't a matter of just violence and against Jews and Catholics and African Americans. For William Simmons it was a moneymaker. Because you had to pay a $5 membership fee, and the local kept $1, the state kept a couple of dollars, and a couple of dollars went to the national. So when you got a couple of thousand, several thousand joining a year, pump in about $5,000–10,000 into William Simmons' pocket. That was not all. Everybody, of course, had to have a robe and a hood to be a Klans member, and you couldn't just go and have the wife make one out of material bought from the Woolworth store. You had to buy an official hood and robe from William Simmons. She made money on that. For some reason, your horse had to have one too, and I had to have a official blanket. It had to be bought from the Atlanta, from William Simmons' KKK store. Every new KKK member had to be baptized by sprinkling. And you couldn't get the water out of the local Satilla River. No, 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 no. It had to come out of the Chattahoochee, and it had to be blessed by William Simmons. And so to get official baptism water, you had to order it from Atlanta for about $1 a bottle. And so it became a moneymaker for William Simmons. And when they tried to get rid of William Simmons in the 1920s, and this is the last time we'll pretty much talk about the Klan, but when they tried to get rid of him in the 1920s, they found out that he owned the name KKK lock, stock, and barrel, and they had to buy him out with several $1,000,000. They had to buy William Simmons out to get rid of him. So this is the rise of the Klan, and again, terrorism has its name again in the South, in the country for that matter. It wasn't just a Southern. The Klan grew greatly in the North and the West as well. One of the prime examples of Georgia in the progressive era is Rebecca Latimer Felton. Here's someone who is a progressive in some areas and very regressive in other areas. Rebecca Latimer Felton was a slave owner. She married and her husband, and they moved to Cartersville, where he owned a plantation. He was also a lawyer. She ran his campaigns, and her husband became a House of Representative member in the State House, and then later a congressman in the U.S. House. Felton was a very good writer. She wrote many of her husband's speeches. She was a great advocate for women's rights, and you did not dare be a man and cross her. She castigated the state legislature for not passing the 19th Amendment. Outstanding speaker for women's rights and for women, not just voting rights, for women's rights in court, divorce, child custody. But by the same time that she was very much advocating women's rights, she advocated lynching of black males. She bought into this idea that white women were constantly being molested by black men, and she believed the only answer for that was lynching. So here's someone who is progressive in one area and very regressive in the other area, which makes her a perfect example of Georgia in the progressive era. Tom Watson won the election in 1920 as U.S. Senator, and serving his first year of his term when he died. And Governor Thomas Hardwick, decided to name Felton to his job in the U.S. Senate to replace Watson. However, there had been a special election that elected the new senator. But the new senator, Hugh Dorsey, decided to allow Felton to serve at least one day. And so Felton became the first woman to ever serve in the U.S. Senate, and from Georgia. But she only served one day. After that, she resigned. Hugh Dorsey took his seat in the U.S. Senate. Kelly Loeffler was appointed to serve out Johnny Isaacsen's term recently. And she became the second U.S. Senator from Georgia. But again, she was appointed by Brian Kemp. If Kelly Loeffler succeeds in winning this election in November, she'll become the first Georgia woman to ever be elected as senator. But we've had two female senators from Georgia, both appointed.